Yep, and it becomes unplugged too, so. Sorry.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome tonight. It's a wonderful joy to welcome you to this very special event to celebrate the launch of the James M. Houston Center for Humanity and the Common Good here at Regent College. Thank you for coming out this evening and for joining with us in this wonderful time together. My name is Paul Spilsbury. I'm the Academic Dean and Professor of New Testament here at the college, and it's an honor to welcome you here this evening. The work and vision of the Houston Center is at the heart of what Regent College has always been about. Grounded in a Christian theological vision of integrated scholarship, the center fosters interdisciplinary and interreligious dialogue on what it means to be human. This is one of the central questions of the modern world. Engaging in a wide range of philosophical perspectives through collaboration with the University of British Columbia and other institutions, the Houston Center aims to articulate and to enact a holistic approach to the common good in response to the unique social, political, and theological issues of our time. Before introducing our speaker and two respondents tonight, I would like to offer a special welcome to a few honored guests. First of all, to Dr. James Houston himself, who's sitting right here. Welcome, sir. As I'm sure you know, Jim Houston is one of the founders of Regent College. He was appointed principal of Regent in 1970. He also taught part-time at the University of British Columbia. Following his time as principal of the college from 1970 to 1978, he was appointed chancellor, as well as professor of spiritual theology, until his appointment in 1991 as the Board of Governors professor of spiritual theology. He's the co-founder of the C.S. Lewis Institute in Washington, D.C., of which he is still a senior fellow. He's a prolific author, editor, and Christian scholar, and respected worldwide as a leader in educating and equipping laypersons. And it's an honor to have you with us tonight, Jim. Thank you for coming. And I also want to acknowledge members of his family represented by Liddell Taylor tonight. Welcome, Liddell. It's lovely to have you with us as well. And then a number of other friends who are with us tonight. I want to give a special welcome to some honored guests, Mr. Mike Eichhorn, the German Consul General from the German Consulate here in Vancouver, Dr. Stephen Pellich from UBC Faculty of Medicine, Dr. York Shung, Professor Emeritus of Vascular Surgery here at UBC, Dr. Todd Martin, the Provost of Trinity Western University, Dr. Jeffrey Greenman, the President of Regent College, and several members of the Regent College Faculty and Board of Governors. Welcome to you all. Good time to clap. So just a quick word about the format for this evening. Our speaker will speak for 40 minutes or so, after which we'll have two formal responses, each of about 10 to 15 minutes or so, I'm told. That sounds about right. And then following the formal responses, there will be an opportunity for all of you to participate, and you can do so by going to one of the two mics. There's a mic over there, and there's a mic over there. I would just ask you to keep your questions clear, succinct, and simple, by which I mean that a question is not allowed to have a thesis statement and several subpoints. And now, let me introduce our evening's speakers. Our keynote speaker this evening is Professor Jens Zimmermann, who is the J.I. Packer Chair of Theology and Director of the Houston Center for Humanity and the Common Good here at Regent College. Dr. Zimmermann is a theologian and professor with interests in anthropology and epistemology, a former Canada Research Chair. He has held academic research fellowships at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. He is currently visiting fellow at the Center for Theology and Modern European Thought at the University of Oxford and a research fellow at the University of the Free State in South Africa. Dr. Zimmermann's current research focuses on theological anthropology in the Christian tradition and the concept of personhood. His most recent book is a monograph on Dietrich Bonhoeffer with Oxford University Press. And then we have two respondents. First of all, Dr. Brent Waters, who is the Emeritus Jerre and Mary Joy Stead Professor of Christian Social Ethics, and the Emeritus Director of the Jerre and Mary Joy Stead Center for Ethics and Values at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. He is the author of Just Capitalism, A Christian Ethic of Globalization, and Christian Moral Theology in an Emerging Technoculture, among many other writings. Professor Waters' primary research interests are in the areas of Christian social and political thought, bioethics, science, and technology. And then our second respondent is Dr. Lisa Sung, who is the visiting Associate Professor of Theology here at Regent College. She has served previously at Northeastern Seminary in Rochester, New York, and at the University of St. Mary of the Lake in Mundelein, Illinois, and before that as Associate Professor of Biblical and Systematic Theology at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Dr. Sung also currently serves as Theologian-in-Residence at the InterVarsity Institute. Her specializations include theological anthropology, especially personhood and identity, and race, ethnicity, and culture. Presently, she is working on two books, Race, Racism, and Christian Moral Identity, and secondly, the Theological Anthropology volume for the Foundations of Evangelical Theology series. So we're looking forward to this evening, and we'll start off by welcoming Dr. Zimmermann, who will now come to speak to us on the topic, Defining Humanity, Defending the Person. Welcome, Dr. Zimmermann.
Well, technology isn't working. Let's see if we can, oh, there we are. Okay, well, welcome to you. Thank you for being here. This is wonderful. It's been a long time since we've had this auditorium this full, and this is just great. So even if this talk is no good, it's just fantastic to see you all here. Thank you for coming. So thank you for attending this lecture, celebrating together the official in-person opening of the James M. Houston Center for Humanity and the Common Good. I can only say just briefly, Jim, what a delight it is to see you here. Thank you for being here. Much of this is owing to your inspiration, so whatever I'm going to say, it's all Jim's fault. So my purpose in this lecture is to share with you my rationale for the center at a theological graduate school on the campus of one of the most cosmopolitan universities here in Canada. What better place than within our Regent UBC learning community with its diverse population to reflect deeply about what it means to be human. My lecture title, Defining Humanity, Defending the Person, reveals my motivation for creating a forum for interdisciplinary dialogue on human identity and on ethics. Okay, maybe you can go to the next slide. I don't know what, there we go. So simply put, I believe that the question of human identity is particularly crucial, as Paul has said, for the future of our society. I believe that we need to defend humanity against powerful ideological, political, and commercial interests that currently seek to reduce persons to functional mechanisms. The defense of human identity requires in turn that we recall who we really are, namely persons in social relations, rooted in life, and therefore fundamentally irreducible to whatever functions our would-be masters have in store for us, especially not those functions conceived by computing engineers and technocrats. We must seek to define and defend the notion of personhood against these reductive tendencies if we want our future to be truly human and therefore to be truly humane. Now, I don't want to spoil a good evening we started by presenting a detailed academic lecture, but rather to share with you in a more programmatic, broader way my rationale for a center on human identity and society. So here's what I want to do in these few minutes. You have to know we normally have 3-hour sessions here at Regent, so 40 minutes, that's like short. So first I'll start with some examples of the reductive scientific technovision that I consider to be the real and present danger to our humanity. And this is the redescription of life in technological, computational terms. And then second, I will briefly sketch the origins and teachings of the scientific technovision to show why we should worry about this threat to our humanity. And then third, I will then conclude by arguing that the recovery of the person can effectively resist this technovision that currently attempts to shape our human identity. So I want to start with these examples of a proliferation of computational metaphors. So I don't know if you have paid attention recently to government policy announcements on solving societal, environmental, and public health problems. If you have, you will have noticed the proliferation of computational metaphors in these announcements. It seems as if someone had decided, overnight as it were, that all sentient biological life, including our human life, is nothing more than hardware, run by informational software. So here are some examples. The first one is from our own Canadian government's think tank Policy Horizons. Here we are told that our future depends on the biodigital convergence, that is, on merging biological human matter with digital computational software in order to reshape nature to optimize ourselves and our environment. The direct quote you have on the slide there from the webpage is, biodigital convergence involves a rethinking of biology as providing both the raw materials and a mechanism for developing innovative processes to create new products, services, and ways of being. End of quotation. So note that the fabric of life has become raw material and a mechanism that will provide new products and services, including new ways of being human. Now my question is nature really just raw material that we may use to digitize life? And then who gets to decide what new ways of being look like? Should we support this attempt to recast living biological entities according to a functional imagination of these policymakers? Unless you think this is just futuristic pie-in-the-sky language of bureaucrats, let me take you back to a recent Canadian health policy announcement. When promoting the COVID vaccine booster campaign, our federal health minister, Jean-Yves Duclos, compared the human immune system to a smartphone battery that requires recharging. Here's a quote from his announcement. "It's like a phone battery. You recharge your phone battery by plugging into electricity. You recharge your vaccination protection by taking action and getting a booster." Duclos simply echoes here the previous statement by Moderna CEO Stéphane Bancel, who also compared annual vaccine shots to iPhone apps that require frequent upgrading. Now, I know we have some medical doctors and researchers in the audience who could comment much more astutely and authoritatively on this astounding reinterpretation of biology, but I trust that most of you will grant that the complex biological immune system and its natural evolution over millions of years is nothing like the computational software of a smartphone app or like a phone battery, and that biological pathogens are not analogous to computer viruses. It is quite likely, moreover, that Bancel and Duclos subscribe to this redefinition of life implied by their analogies. If so, then their imagination has become so captivated by the scientific technovision of reality that they have become blind to the difference between human biological life and a computer. Needless to say, this blindness can seriously harm people. If we redefine human life in terms of machine functionality to peddle our latest technologies, what damage will we inflict on ourselves by ignoring the highly complex psychosomatic unity of the living human being? How long, I wonder, will it be until we suggest, for the sake of the common good, no less, the deletion of human beings who no longer function properly? Well, not long, apparently, given the claim in a recent report by the Canadian Medical Association that euthanasia, or doctor-assisted death, could be a profitable enterprise by saving the Canadian healthcare system dollars we would otherwise have to spend on palliative care. I mean, you got to think about that, how shocking it is to talk about human beings like that. Has the unique dignity and irreplaceable worth of each person simply disappeared overnight? My second example is from a new executive order penned by US President Joe Biden on, you have the title there, Advancing Biotechnology and Biomanufacturing Innovation. So according to this presidential order, one of the most influential nations on earth will now look to biotechnology and biomanufacturing for innovative solutions in health, climate change, energy, food security, agriculture, supply chain resilience, and national and economic security. So again, let's look at a key paragraph of Biden's order. He writes, or the order writes, sorry, for biotechnology and biomanufacturing to help us achieve our societal goals, the United States needs to invest in foundational scientific capabilities. We need to develop genetic engineering technologies and techniques to be able to write circuitry for cells and predictably program biology in the same way in which we write software and program computers. Unlock the power of biological data, including through computing tools and artificial intelligence, and advance the science of scale-up production while reducing the obstacles for commercialization so that innovative technologies and products, same language as from the Horizon Policy page, can reach markets faster. Note once again the dominance of computational metaphors here. Cells are no longer living entities, but essentially reprogrammable coded circuitry. Biology becomes some kind of computational hardware to be run by predictably programmed software, in the same way, he says, in which we write software and program computers. We read further in this order that regulative hurdles to commercialization of these new products have to be reduced to usher in this bioeconomy faster and more successfully. Now, those of you who are familiar with Ivan Illich's critique of the healthcare industry, or with Seamus O'Mahony's more recent criticism of managerial medicine, may well shudder at expediting the already problematic government-corporate collusion in healthcare. Illich and Mahoney exposed the corruption of regulatory licensing bodies for drugs and the inhumanity through which pharma and tech companies often pursue profits. If such critics are right, the executive order's admonition that commercialization of new technologies will be subject to ethical and responsible use of biotechnology rings rather hollow. Now, these examples of a pervasive scientific technovision demonstrate a fundamental redefinition of life and living beings in technological terms. So please note, I'm not dismissing technology, nor am I dismissing natural science. Technology has always been part of human development, and together with modern science, continues to help alleviate human toil and suffering. Just recently, my own kidney stone removal reminded me just how important science and technology can be for improving human lives. What I do object to is the ideology of technology embraced by those scientists and computing engineers who reduce life to mechanistic computational functions. And I want to convince you that this radical change in the ideology of our human identity constitutes perhaps the greatest challenge of our time. Think if this was your insulin pump. Like, good luck. I could have picked many more examples from the rapidly growing multi-billion-dollar industry committed to merging biology and computing technology to enhance human life. This industry is fueled by an ideology called transhumanism, which I used to think was a kind of a sideshow of industrialists or something. Transhumanists believe that we can engineer ourselves into a different species, overcoming all human bodily limitations, from suffering to even dying itself, and all environmental problems by merging human biology with computing technology. It is a basic premise of transhumanism that biological life is explicable and therefore also manipulable in computational terms. The reason I picked these particular examples of government announcements for you today is to demonstrate that transhumanist ideology has gone mainstream and is now driving government policies. I mean, a presidential executive order. When the American government announces that it will achieve its societal goals based on the belief that life is programmable like computers, this means that social relations and social practices, including the healthcare of a whole nation, are all material to be reshaped by a transhumanist anthropology. I think this is as serious as it gets. We are witnessing at the broadest cultural and political level a shift in the definition of the person from a living human being, before conceived as a complex unity of body, spirit, and social relations, to a mere functional, programmable mechanism. And this redefinition, as I suggested earlier, presents the greatest challenge of our time. There we go. You may think, wait a minute, Jens, what about immigration, economics, euthanasia, pandemics, an escalating war in Europe, climate change, and the environmental degradation, etc., etc.? Those are real problems. Believe me, 5 years ago, before I embarked on a research project on technology and human flourishing, I would have exactly raised the same objection. However, over the last 5 years, with the help of an interdisciplinary team of scholars from all over the world, I've come to this twofold conclusion. First, how we approach any of these perceived crises, any social or political issues, hinges fundamentally on who we think we are as human beings, on our anthropology. And second, we are rapidly departing from our inherited anthropology. Most of our Western post-World War II constitutions and ethical conventions are based on the notion that human beings are persons of unique, inviolable, individual dignity and irreplaceable worth. The human freedoms, rights, and responsibilities that we have thus far enjoyed are all based on that assumption. We are currently replacing this definition of ourselves as persons, as living human subjects, with one of ourselves as programmable functional mechanisms. And we're doing this in the name of the common good, of saving society and of saving the planet. But a functional mechanism has no dignity, no individuality, and no inherent rights. If this computational metaphor of human identity prevails, how long will it be until the person is sacrificed to the program? What kind of common good are we still pursuing if it is no longer defined in human terms? And who is the programmer? And who are the programmed? These are some of the philosophical, ethical, and political questions I hope our new center can pursue. So the question is, how did we get to this point? As my examples have shown, our humanity is threatened, at least I think it is, by the growing dominance of what the French philosopher Michel Henry has called a scientific techno-vision of reality. As we have seen, adherents of this vision redefine life in mechanistic and increasingly in computational terms. Since the 1950s, in movements like cybernetics, but also within neo-Darwinian evolutionary biology and psychology, we have witnessed the mechanization and then the digitization of biological life in general and of human beings in particular. Somehow the computer has become the dominant metaphor of the resulting vision of reality. The dynamics of organic life become reduced to code, including the human genome. The biologist Richard Dawkins, I'm sure the name is familiar to you, he has, for example, proclaimed boldly that, I quote, "Life is just bytes and bytes and bytes of digital information." And he insists that this assessment is not a metaphor, it is the plain truth. Now, as you know, the expression plain truth is, of course, another metaphor. While we may forgive a genetic scientist for misunderstanding the nature of human language, we should not forgive his own inadequate metaphor of life as digital information. Life is nothing like a computational mechanism. Rather, life, and especially human life, is a mystery beyond our comprehension, something we can try to describe, but we will never fully grasp or explain. Above all, organic life, in which human life is rooted, is principally based in living bodies with a metabolism driven by the urge to exist. From the lowest to the highest living organisms, we witness what Evan Thompson, an esteemed colleague here from UBC, has described as biological autopoiesis, that is, a life form's self-maintaining, self-organizing existence through metabolistic exchange in distinction from its environment. Even a simple organism like a living cell sustains its own self-enclosed existence by discerning good from bad sustenance, for instance. Thus, even at this primitive level, one can find a rudimentary form of a kind of intentionality, of an awareness, of a sort of discernment, and even perhaps cognition in this purposeful, metabolistic, self-organizing effort of a living organism. And it is in this effort that originate the sensed and bodily needs of lack, of fulfillment. And as we then move up the ladder of complexity among living beings with emergent sentience, these basic physical needs of lack and fulfillment become hunger, thirst, suffering, fulfillment, joy, and in humans even happiness and things like that. Now, a number of important conclusions follow from this assessment of life. First, all material elements within a living organism are held together, integrated, and shaped by the purposeful self-organization of that living being. So contrary to Dawkins' claim that genes and genetic codes are not pre-existing information, he claims that these are all pre-existing information that code all of life, and that life is simply an expression of this code. That's not true. The genes themselves arise from and are shaped in the service of organic life. Clearly, Dawkins has internalized a computational metaphor of genetic codes as software that run the evolutionary hardware, which he then misleadingly imposes back on life itself. Another important conclusion is that human interiority and consciousness are deeply rooted in this biological life, in this metabolistic struggle and striving, and therefore in continuity with it. Philosophers like Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Hans Jonas, and Evan Thompson here at UBC, together with our own Houston Cellar fellow Thomas Fuchs, he's a clinical psychiatrist from Heidelberg in Germany, in their work they show that meaning is not what the mind makes of otherwise empty mechanical sense impressions. Human cognition is not based on mere pattern recognition by a computer-like brain. Rather, we experience a meaningful world as embodied subjects based and rooted in this life that I've been describing. Our body is not an inert exterior conductor of sense impressions to an interior isolated computational mind. Rather, as Ponty once put it, I quote, "Our relationship to things is not a distant one. Each speaks to our body and to the way we live. These objects we encounter are clothed in human characteristics. They're docile, they're soft, they're hostile, or even resistant to our touch, and so on. And conversely, these objects dwell within us as emblems of forms of life we either love or hate." So it's a truly life-embodied kind of way of perception. And this bodily perception of meaning is the very source of the intrinsic metaphoricity of language that Dawkins so obviously fails to understand. We understand the meaning of human actions by liking them to how we relate to other objects or how we inhabit space, right? That's why we say things like, love is like a rose, or we say stuff like, let's get down to business, this kind of geographical vector. This is all body language. Language itself thus demonstrates the corporeality of human interiority and of human perception. So the question again is, how do we get from the rich, embodied view of life we've just described to Dawkins' computational model of life as sheer digital information? In his book, Barbarism, Michel Henry traces this development back to the astronomer, physicist, and engineer Galileo Galilei, I'm sure you've heard of the name, who believed mathematics to be the language of God inscribed in nature. Mathematics is the language of individual objects and their relations, and this is certainly one way in which humans perceive the world. We are bodies bumping into each other, after all. But it's only a very limited way of seeing. Neither life's organic aspects of development, right, from a baby to an adult, nor least of all human personal qualities like love, sacrifice, wisdom, beauty, and so on, can be captured by metrics. No matter what university administrators keep trying to do to, learning outcomes by metrics is just really an interesting but misguided idea. The objectifying method of quantifying observation is only adequate for a certain kind of truth. We all know the objectifying method of scientific experiments requires scientists to abstract whatever they examine from the complex flow of life to observe and quantify an isolated object under a stable artificial laboratory condition. Over time, unfortunately, scientists began to take the abstraction for the real thing, and thus began to define life itself in non-living, quantifiable, functional terms. And when this method is turned on the living human subject, the interiority and intentionality, indeed all the sensible qualities that make up human experience, they're set aside as secondary considerations at best, or even as illusions. And this mathematization of human experience developed gradually into an entire scientific technological worldview that reduces everything to measurable and predictable functions. So here we are. This belief that life is fundamentally to be understood functionally, in which every human experience is boiled down to some kind of code, program, or mechanism, became most firmly entrenched then, again, with the rise of computational theology, as I've said. So we are in the business then of creating a scientific or a techno-scientific world, a world in which the living human subject becomes replaced by dead material and digitized functions. Your natural sensations, perceptions, sufferings, and joys of our embodied, life-rooted, socially oriented human existence, they're replaced by the supposedly more objective truth that all of our subjective experiences are explicable as biochemical processes directed by evolutionary algorithms. And as a result of this radical shift, we begin to treat human beings like quantifiable, programmable mechanisms, subject to technical modification and improvement. As Michel Henry explains, I quote, "In a society engendered by the blind self-development of technoscience, technical devices gradually replace the subjective practice of human beings." And as my examples have shown, increasingly human nature and human relations are becoming defined by and subservient to the possibilities of modern biotechnologies. Because we start looking like biotechnology, the solutions are offered in terms of biotechnology. And conversely, as our understanding of human life diminishes, we no longer have a problem with attributing human qualities to machines. The transhumanist obsession with intelligence or even sentience in artificial intelligence is only possible once we have forgotten that sentience and intelligence are possible only on the basis of an organic metabolistic life. No body, no sentience. No human body, no intelligence or understanding. I don't know why that's so hard to get straight. Like a machine cannot feel, it can therefore not understand, it cannot think. One of the most important insights I gained over the last 5 years of research into technology and human flourishing comes from the computer scientist and Microsoft engineer Jerre Lanier. AI, he reminds us, I quote, "is nothing but a story we tell about our code." It's nothing but a story we tell about our code. The story, he confesses, was originally invented by tech engineers to procure funding from government agencies. Right? You go to government and say, look, we're developing the next artificial sentient brain here. Do you want us to develop it in America, or do you want the Russians to do it? How many millions can you shove over? That's how that works. So AI, in short, does not exist, artificial intelligence, if one implies that machines actually think or feel with even the lowest form of consciousness that we find in organic life. Lanier warns that the whole gamut of computing technology erodes our self-understanding of what it means to be truly human. And he worries, here's a quotation from him, he worries, he says, if you design a society to suppress belief in consciousness and experience, to reject any exceptional nature to personhood, then maybe people can become like machines. The greatest danger, he concludes, is the loss of what sets us apart from all other entities, the loss of our personhood. His warning echoes the prophetic voices of other critics, like the former software coder Steve Talbot, for instance, has written a great book, The Future Does Not Compute, or the philosopher Hubert Dreyfus, who also worried that instead of adapting technology to human intelligence, we slowly conform human consciousness to the functional logic of machines. Right? So the dehumanizing future is just one scroll away. Already in 1943, the Oxford Don and public Christian intellectual C.S. Lewis warned about the dire consequences of this development in his prescient book, The Abolition of Man. Right? You could translate it as the self-destruction of the human being. Lewis identified the human desire to master nature as the fundamental motivation behind the rising mechanization of life. He predicted 3 detrimental consequences of this scientific technovision. First, to conquer nature, we have to shrink it to a manageable size. Prior to the scientific revolution, he says, nature stood for material and spiritual order that maintained objective norms for human flourishing. Nature contained not only the material, but also the noumenal, the sacred, and the spiritual dimensions that corresponded to the human questions about the meaning of life. The Greek word cosmos we still use means order. That's why we sell cosmetics, right? To create order out of chaos. So this harkens back to this original view of nature as a higher order to which humans have to conform. Modern science stripped nature of all non-material values that formerly provided objective norms for human nature and human flourishing. But without recourse to this universal order, or what used to be called natural law or something like that, nothing is sacred, and we can no longer appeal to objective natural standards for human flourishing or ethics. Everything has become, indeed, raw material. And then second, Lewis says, once nature has been reduced to raw material, human nature is sure to follow. Human nature, Lewis writes, I quote, will be the last part of nature to surrender to man. The battle will be won. We shall knit our own fate and be henceforth free to make our own species whatever we wish it to be. End of quotation. As we did with nature, we will reimagine human beings as soulless raw material that can be shaped at will by the power of technology. We will say, Lewis writes, let us decide for ourselves what a human being is to be and make him into that, not on any ground of imagined value, but because we want him to be such. Having mastered our environment, let us now master ourselves and choose our own destiny. End of quotation. And that is exactly the position taken by the transhumanists. And third and finally, Lewis raises the all-important political question. Once the battle to conquer nature through technology has been won, he asks, whose victory is it? The battle, he writes, to master nature will indeed be won, but who precisely will have won it? Lewis' answer to this question is insightful as it is sobering. Man's conquest of nature, he writes, if the dreams of some scientific planners are realized, means the rule of a few hundred of men over billions and billions of men. Lewis argues that our supposed mastery of nature will result in slavery to a functionalist view of nature, and slavery to applied technology, which will then be exercised by a political technocratic elite who controls access to the power of technology over less privileged people. So, I conclude the lecture with what I consider to be the only viable countermove to the current erasure of our human dignity and identity. I've learned over the years that criticism itself, as important as it is, cannot produce real change. It will do no good to attack the prevalent scientific technovision of reality unless we have something positive to put into its place. We have to articulate and promote a more adequate understanding of ourselves as persons. We have said that the technoscientific vision does away with the person, but what actually is a person? To note the disappearance of something implies that we know what is missing. What exactly a person is, however, remains difficult to say. In one of the best modern books on personhood, the sociologist Christian Smith defines the person with this very dense definition, which I'm using for the sake of time. So this is lots to digest there. He defines a person as a conscious, reflexive, embodied, self-transcending center of subjective experience, of agency, durable identity, moral commitment, and social communication, who, as the efficient cause of his or her responsible actions, like that's the agency, and interaction, exercises complex capacities for agency and intersubjectivity in order to develop and sustain his or her own incommunicable self in loving relationships with other personal selves and with a non-personal world. I hope it took him hours to put that one together, okay? Because it's really everything is in there when you unpack that. I'm only going to pull out 3 features of the person in Smith's definition here that I think are especially important. First, the person is a body or has a body. And to some extent, we are our bodies. The spirit or presence of a person exists for us only in bodily form. Second, a person is a free moral agent. Unlike other animals, human beings as persons can step outside of their immediate environment and evaluate the world, themselves, and others according to a kind of abstraction and abstract ideals. This ability is the basis for the particular human quality of reasoning that makes possible art, literature, science, and religion. And Smith's third feature of the person in this definition is perhaps the most crucial, and that's the idea of the incommunicable self. This takes us beyond the notion that human beings are merely rational animals with capacities. Okay? The human person is an incommunicable self. That is to say, a person is not something exhausted by its definition of quantities or capacities. A person is not a thing or merely the sum total of certain characteristics. No doubt, certain abilities and features are always intrinsically part of being a person, and they help us to identify someone as John, Ruth, and Mary with certain capacities and so on. But a person's self, as Smith says, is incommunicable and cannot be captured by even the most complete list of characteristics. This is so because a person is not something consisting of many individual parts or layers, but rather a unique someone who has, holds, and inhabits these features. In other words, persons are not like an onion made from layers of qualities or capacities, and when you peel back each layer and each feature, that at the end you hold nothing in your hands. This incommunicable self, a presence that's irreducible to any particular identifiable quantity or quality, is the essence of personhood. It is a mystery impossible to capture in concepts or words, and it's nonetheless real. You hear reports of parents of severely disabled children who have no rational or brain capacity, and yet they will speak of Oliver's presence, of a person. Our society must uphold this reality as the anthropological basis for our social practices and policies. Human beings are persons, and every person is an irreplaceable presence, no matter what his or her capabilities may be. The most severely handicapped or disabled person is as precious and worthy of our attention as our supposedly great leaders in society. On this basis, and on this basis alone, can we approach social issues in a way that ensures humane solutions. Neither disability nor human suffering and death our program malfunctions. So during this lecture, I've already mentioned some philosophical resources for establishing human identity as that of living, embodied subjects. I end here on the Judeo-Christian tradition in which our Houston Center is rooted. This tradition has contributed much to this view of human dignity. The Jewish tradition already taught that the personal creator God structures all of reality. Martin Buber made that clear in his path-breaking work, I and Thou. Christianity added to this teaching that God became human to demonstrate the true nature of personal reality. The incarnation certainly confirmed against all Gnostic influences the intrinsic importance of the body for being human. Equally important, however, the incarnation also sketched out more fully what it meant to insist that human beings are made in the image of God. God himself, in the person of Jesus Christ, showed human identity to be personal freedom lived in responsibility to others, and so allowed individual freedom and difference to exist in communion, bound together by love. So Christ, by becoming human, using his omnipotent power, not to rule over people and so on, but to sacrifice, to live for others, that's a really important paradigm. So it's important that you hear me well here. I'm not saying that Christianity somehow single-handedly invented the notion of the person, nor were Christians consistently interested or even successful in pursuing human dignity through their actions. At the same time, however, the concept of the human person would not have developed in the way I've described above without the Christian message of God's becoming human, suffering, and dying on behalf of all, even for the least of these, in order to restore and perfect creation in the new humanity of Jesus Christ. Those of you who are ancient world scholars will know how radically the idea of the incarnation changed the perception of human identity in the ancient world. Over time, social status, race, or gender became secondary to the fundamental equality people had as those being made in God's image. Moreover, the sacredness of the person now grounded the right to the sovereignty of the self and to bodily autonomy. No one could be sacrificed to a higher cause anymore, no matter what the cause is, not to the fatherland, not to the economy, not to the common good, not to saving the planet, or whatever the media and politicians deem the right highest cause to be. Theologians of the early church constantly appealed to God's philanthropy, his love for the human being, regardless of status or ethnicity, to ground our recognition of every other fellow human being's inviolable dignity. The early church preached that the eternal Word of God, Christ, in whose image we were created, loved the creature who had arrogantly turned away from him so much that he entered into creation to the point of death to save it. The all-powerful God used his power and responsibility to redeem the weaker. For example, the patristic theologian Basil of Caesarea taught that Christ calls people to follow his example in becoming, in the Greek, koinonikos anthropos, a communal or social human being who would promote another's well-being. Likewise, my favorite modern theologian, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, argued that the incarnation not only founds the dignity of every human being, but also teaches us that being human means to live responsibly, live in response and responsibility for other people. Because of Christ, who chose in his freedom to die for the sake of every human being, the human freedom that belongs to being made in God's image, and that's essential to it, is immediately tied to responsibility for others. There is no simple freedom from, there's always only freedom for. Christ showed us, as patristic theologians were fond of saying, that being made in Christ's image means being logikoi, that is, in conformity with the Logos, with Christ, the universal Logos through whom all things were made. To be Christ-like means to follow his example of recognizing in every other person the image of God. Most importantly, Christ's example defines love as the will to promote another's well-being. Perhaps the best image of this, to describe this love, is the mother-child relation. Ideally, from the first moment, a mother wills her child to flourish and ultimately to become independent of her as another free, flourishing individual. If kids would only understand that, well, that's why we tell them, don't do this, don't do that, live like that, because we want you to be free and strong and independent of us. We want you to function, properly. Now, I hope you're getting a sense of the difference between this personalist vision of human identity and the computational metaphor evoked in the recent examples of public policy we had at the beginning. Shifting human identity from persons to functionality has a profoundly dehumanizing effect on how we conceive society. You don't respect a program. You control it, improve it, rewrite it. Today, China's current totalitarian technology-based surveillance state illustrates in real time the social and political future of the technocratically conceived, increasingly inhumane society. When persons become cell phone batteries, compassion dies. When a technology no longer functions, you junk it and replace it with the next version. Personhood, by contrast, negates utilitarianism, while the scientific technovision places functionality, efficiency, and utility at the heart of reality. Personhood cherishes freedom, difference, creativity, within a framework of personal communion founded on mutual recognition as persons. The scientific technovision, on the other hand, promotes conformity, groupthink, and reduces love to an emotion that can be simulated by robots. Personhood requires the proximity of the skin for schooling in empathy and neighborly love. I would again recommend the work of my colleague Thomas Fuchs on the importance of proximity in the skin for learning empathy. The technovision is satisfied with digital remote contact because all we need is information exchange. So my hope is that the Houston Center will be a place where we explore and celebrate together what it means to be a human person, so that we may learn to use technology wisely and perhaps even reverse the current trend of dehumanizing ourselves. In the years to come, our center here at Regent College will focus on philosophical and theological anthropology to tackle these important sociological, economic, medical, political, and ethical, bioethical questions of our time. And already this year, as I said earlier, we staged several events, and I'm encouraged by the participation of UBC colleagues and other top scholars from around the world in participating in this effort. And I do invite you all to share in this enterprise, whichever way you can or are interested in, and however you're able. In other words, whether you like the lecture or not, please do stay in touch and do come back. And thank you for your attention. Thank you. Now I invite Lisa and Brent to come up for the response.
Jens, you are one of the most astute philosophical theologians, or are you a theological philosopher? In either case, you're one of the best thinkers I know, and this evening you did not disappoint. Your lecture provided a fitting opening of the Houston Center, for I believe there is no more pressing challenge than defining humanity and defending the person in these troubling times in which we live. The very ideas of what it means to be human and being a humane person are everywhere under assault. And they are crucial moral ideals that need and deserve to be defended, and defended thoughtfully and vigorously. You have identified with great clarity what is at stake in these troubling days where nonsense seems to reign, and made the case why more measured judgment is needed. Your lecture will serve as an important landmark for the Houston Center to keep it focused on humanity and the common good. We who make our living in the academy, however, are a critical lot, so I cannot spend my time simply praising you, for that would be tantamount to committing academic malpractice. But neither do I wish to quarrel with you. I'm reminded of Robertson Davies' words, though academics love bickering, they hate rows. So instead, I offer a couple of finicky observations. First, George Grant offered a scathing critique of the emerging technoculture. Technology is not simply a collection of ubiquitous machines and gadgets, but has become the metaphysic of our age, driving and justifying a relentless pursuit of mastering nature and human nature. He warned that the consequences of this pursuit were dire. Such fundamental and enduring convictions concerning the good, justice, and freedom were being debased into a vacuous rhetoric of values that could easily be twisted to justify the whims of cultural and political elites. We are already living in a moral twilight, and the ensuing shadows are steadily growing more lengthy and darker. What can and should be done? Grant insisted that the first step of resistance is to name the darkness as darkness. Only then can we deal with the thing as it is. And a brief aside before continuing, it is a rare pleasure for someone like me to refer to George Grant north of the border for a change. Jens, your lecture addressed much of our present darkness, but I'm not sure if it was sufficiently dark. Ironically, your account of our present circumstances could have been simultaneously a bit more overt and a bit more subtle. Let me explain. As you point out, the fabric of daily life is increasingly being woven in response to a purportedly scientific calculus that is in turn applied in technologically analogous ways. We come to think of ourselves as human and humane versions of technological artifacts. We think of ourselves as walking computers and telephones. This imaginative sense of identity is admittedly creepy, but the trajectory of this trend is far grimmer. As the algorithmic patterns shaping daily life become more complicated, ordinary people cannot be trusted to apply them correctly. They must be told what to do. That task should be assigned to experts who know what they are doing, especially if the goal is to make our daily lives as risk-free as possible. This paternalism was, I believe, on display in many of the policies reacting to COVID-19. With a kind of Gnostic certainty, we were told when and where we could go, and virtually every aspect of our daily lives were subject to regulation and surveillance, and in some instances, the coercive power of the state was used to enforce compliance. My overt worry is, why stop there? Why not use technology to limit the risk of accidents and contagion that comes in interacting with other people? An empty or faceless public square is a small price to pay for safety. The metaverse may prove more appealing than we imagine. I worry that the consequences of such preferred or enforced isolation might hold over time for our understanding of humanity and the common good. Jens, sounding a speculative alarm need not be shrill, but it needs to be sounded. More subtly, the technocratic mindset is perhaps more pervasive than you let on. This is especially true in respect to the extent that transhumanist ideas have infiltrated standard healthcare. For example, aging is now increasingly and routinely referred to as a disease that can be treated and maybe someday cured. This subtle rhetorical move, however, has radical implications. Traditionally, medicine has seen the body as an object of care, which required dealing with finitude and mortality. But if aging is a disease rather than the normal decline of an embodied person over time, then the body is no longer an object of care. It is a problem to be solved. And solving this problem will require a relentless recourse to ever more sophisticated technologies and extending longevity further and further out. Artifice becomes far more preferable to the natural. And that raises a plethora of questions of what it means to be human, as people are transformed into artifacts of medical and technological ingenuity. We must name the present darkness as darkness. Grant can help us do that, but we must also move out of the darkness into light. And here Grant is of little help. His faith effectively ends with Good Friday, perhaps a consequence of spending so much time reading and contemplating Simone Weil. But I digress. Jens, in your lecture, you move beyond the darkness and offer some glimpses of light, and I want to elaborate on that just a little. As I read the last section of your lecture on recovering our humanity and the importance of personhood, to invoke my Methodist friends, my heart was strangely warmed. And I want to endorse and reinforce the central role that love can and should play in this recovery. Love is admittedly a theologically freighted term. In the Christian tradition, for instance, it is the content of Christ's two great commands regarding God and neighbor. But this theological pedigree should not disqualify love from widespread usage, for it also has philosophical import. Iris Murdoch insisted, "We need a moral philosophy in which the concept of love, so rarely mentioned now by philosophers, can once again be made central." Her reason for this insistence is that we can only see and understand the good of the other by attending to the other. Moreover, the other can only truly be seen through the just and loving gaze. And in such attending, Murdoch reminds us that it is only particular persons, be they family, friends, strangers, or enemies, that can be seen and loved in a myriad of appropriate ways. To be blunt, in the absence of love, recovering humanity and protecting persons is a fool's errand. And I hope that love's foundational import will at least occasionally be highlighted in the programs and projects of the Houston Center. In respect to persons, I found your use of C.S. Lewis to be timely and on target, and I add the following as a kind of side dish supporting your entree. Lewis reminds us that there are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal, and it is in the company of these beings headed toward an eternal destiny, whom we joke with, marry, snub, and exploit, and our charity then must always be real and costly love. Next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. Lewis also insisted that persons should have chests as well as heads, loving hearts and thinking heads. I hope the Houston Center will be one of those important intersections where heads and hearts come together in thoughtful and engaging ways. Jens, my friend, congratulations on your appointment as director of the Houston Center. I wish you much happiness and success as you undertake this new endeavor. Being the director means you will get to spend time contemplating and discussing lofty ideas, but not all the time. Sometimes you'll need to get into the weeds to get things done. As you know, I retired a few months ago. In my nearly 45-year career, I directed 3 centers. So here is some advice, and since it is free, it is probably worth the price you will pay for it. All right. Nonetheless, here goes. I developed 6 rules that I tried to follow and tried to persuade my staff and student interns to follow. Rule 1, if you can't do it well, don't do it. Rule 2, mind the details, but never let them see you sweat. 3, if something isn't going well, don't blame, fix it. 4, don't worry about who gets the credit. 5, never skimp on hospitality. Rule 6, and finally, except for Christmas, never surprise the dean or the president.
Let me begin just by saying what a joy it is to be present in this inaugural gathering of the James Houston Center for Humanity and the Common Good. And I want to thank Jens for the privilege of being able to offer a brief response to his lecture introducing the vision for the center. And just to clarify, I'm approaching this discussion from a theistic, Christian theistic, Trinitarian theistic frame of reference, and as a systematic theologian. The perils of systematic theology are many as we endeavor to learn about all of the, as much as we can from all of the relevant disciplines that pertain to the subject under investigation. So in many ways we are amateurs or amateurs of the host of other disciplines, in this case of systematic theology. So I recognize and appreciate that not everyone here tonight does his or her work within that same framework, and I believe that the plurality of perspectives and domains of experience and expertise that are represented in this room can be mutually beneficial, sharpening, refining, and enriching each and all. I also want to make it clear that in my following remarks, I'm speaking in my own right, not representing the views of the center as such, or even the director and the fellows, and actually a little bit later on it might various issues may surface. But so I want to just begin by noting that there's so much to appreciate in Jens's presentation, especially his focus on transhumanism and his critique of the transhumanist vision as reductionistic, especially his insistence that a purely physicalist and mechanistic account of the human person is inadequate to the reality, to the lived reality and existence of human persons, that fails to do justice to the richness of human experience. In other words, the mechanistic, view of human beings as quantifiable programmed mechanisms subject to technical modification and improvement that simply requires better and better upgrades, is a classic example of what's called a thin description. A thin description endeavors to render as a minimal account of an entity as possible. And thin descriptions serve valuable but limited ends. Thin descriptions are true as far as they go. The problem with them is when we engage in reductionism, when a lower level factor is treated as causal rather than as a contributing factor in a complex, unified structure and system within the larger fields of existence within which the entity under examination is situated, which condition and impinge upon it, and reciprocally that entity has its effects on its environment. So in a thin description, monofactorial analysis and monocausal explanations are treated as if they account for the totality of this complex, unified reality of living substances, while other integral and influential factors are dismissed. So the whole scientific model of the reality of emergence, whereby we require a physical account, a chemical account, a biological account, but then I would say also an account of the features, dimensions and features that are traditionally associated with the mind, the psycho-social and moral capacities cannot be. They are dependent on lower level factors, but cannot be themselves explained by and fundamentally reducible to those lower level factors. So you've pointed out very clearly and helped us to see how these mechanistic conceptions of human being as reducible to bytes and bytes of data simply doesn't do justice to the complex reality of human beings, particularly with respect to the dimensions of the mind. So I want to briefly, I'm going to query one major claim and 2 points in your argument, and draw a conclusion and make a modest proposal based on this. And we'll consider them in reverse order. The 2 points that I'll initially focus on have to do with Jens's reference to human beings as free moral agents. I begin by observing that Christian Smith's description of the human being helpfully enumerates a number of qualities, but it is aggregative rather than synthetic. To put it another way, I think his argument may fall short of identifying and capturing what is distinctive to human persons in terms of their ultimate capacities. So I'm just going to briefly sketch the argument, a long-standing line of argument within the broader Christian tradition of Christian thought to characterize the species or the kind that humans comprise. Human beings are moral agents. That is the basis for drawing a fundamental distinction and a basic ontological distinction between human beings and all other sentient forms of biological life, of organic life, who do exhibit increasingly complex structures and capacities. In brief, following the philosopher Keith Yandell, a moral agent is an autonomous source of choices and actions, which entails that a person can, in fact, do A and can, in fact, refrain from doing an A. An agent who is autonomous with respect to a morally significant choice or action, one which is right or one which is wrong, is responsible for doing or refraining from doing A. A removal of autonomy or freedom entails removal of responsibility. And furthermore, to be a moral agent is to possess a first-person perspective, to be subjectively self-aware in a direct way, and to be self-directed in one's choices among alternatives on morally relevant occasions, and at least retrospectively, reflectively, rightly able to be called upon to give reasons for one's choices, which are invariably embedded in narrative accounts, a point that both Paul Ricoeur and Alistair MacIntyre make well. So Yandell goes on to describe the import of the Judeo-Christian understanding of the human person as created in the image of God in this way, quote, "A person's fundamental obligation is to mature in the potential built into the Imago Dei." Central to this potential in the Christian tradition is the capacity for agape love, which can be characterized as acting in what one reflectively takes to be the best interests of others without concern for personal benefit. So agape in the Christian tradition is ranked as among the highest virtues, and it's the summative characteristic in which all of the other virtues typically are presented in Scripture. So to characterize human persons as moral agents, according to Yandell, is not to deny the status of full personhood, the dignity and rights and considerations that are owed to those who are unable to engage in and exercise the faculties of reflection, deliberation, choice, and effective action. Infants, for instance, or those who live with all kinds of impairments and so forth. Yandell suggests that, quote, S is a person if and only if S is accountable for S's deeds, choices, and actions, or if S is a member of a species whose members normally are accountable for their deeds. So to summarize, I think you rightly point out an implication in Smith's definition that humans are moral agents endowed with the second order capacity to be self-directed, able to make specific choices or to act or refrain from acting on morally relevant occasions, for good or for ill, and who, on this view, have the capacity for agape love and the concomitant duty to learn how to make their choices and act for the best interests of others without self-gain, growing in the mature personal realization of their potential to emulate God. Thus, while I appreciate the numerous ways that Jens, drawing on the work of biologists and philosophers of science, highlights the similarities that we as human persons share with all biological species and all forms of sentient creatures, I do have reservations about describing non-human forms of life in terms of intentionality, awareness, and discernment. And let me explain a little bit why I have these reservations. While on the one hand, I think that the philosopher Matthew Hall, in his book Plants as Persons, A Philosophical Botany, rightly argues against the views that place plants outside the bounds of moral consideration. His thesis has been summarized this way. He notes that some indigenous beliefs actually recognize plants as relational, intelligent beings who are the appropriate recipients of respect and care. And according to Hall, recent scientific findings encourage this perspective, revealing that plants possess many of the capacities of sentience and mentality traditionally denied them. So while I want to very much appreciate the similarities and the resemblances that we share in terms of these underlying levels, as it were, or dimensions of our bodies, all biological entities move toward and ingest sources of nutrition and other life-conducive factors in their immediate environment that are needed for subsistence and development, and they emit information. However, with some philosophers of science, I believe that the distinction between teleonomic and teleologic causes, or grounds, or reasons for motion and development, best explains the difference between plants and human agents, and that distinction better serves our purposes here. We can reserve the term teleonomic for those explanations that ascribe the apparent purposiveness present in the structure and function of all living organisms, the locus of which is internal or innate to the organism, which directs them which unfolds in lived existence and is directed toward their respective ends. But we ought to reserve the designation teleological and the concept of the teleological for explanations that involve the faculty of rationality in a richly complex sense. A moral agent is free insofar as he or she exercises uncoerced choice when confronting alternative courses of action, and is thus self-directed and not merely inner-directed. And therein lies the distinction that I'm making between teleonomic and teleological. Agents' inclinations, dispositions, attitudes, and behavior originate from themselves as autonomous sources of their own choices and actions, as Yandel points out. And the term logos denotes reason, denotes intelligible, meaningful thought and discourse. So agents, human agents, are purposive, goal-directed, and their behavior is explicable by the reasons they hold for choosing to act in certain ways or to refrain from doing so. Human beings, as moral agents, can be called upon to give an account for their choices and actions, which are subject to evaluation by oneself and by others. And for that matter, I won't spend a lot of time here, and I know this proposition might be a little bit more controversial. Moral agency is also the basis for differentiating animal life from human persons, qua moral agents. As the philosopher J.P. Moreland observes, virtually all animals have certain sorts of sensations. For instance, experiences of pain, of taste, of pleasure. Many, if not most animals, seem to have desires as well, such as the desire for food. Many appear to engage in thinking and have certain sorts of beliefs. For example, a dog seems to be able to engage in means-to-end reasoning If he wants to go through the door to get food, and if the door is closed, he's going to find a way to achieve the desired end. And many animals also engage in willings, that they will to do certain things, though there's no adequate evidence to suggest that they have libertarian freedom. It's more likely that an animal's will is determined by its beliefs, desires, and above all, sensations and bodily states. And we share all of those capacities. Nevertheless, there are several capacities that animals don't seem to have. Besides freedom of the will, the ability to entertain alternatives, and choosing to act or refrain from acting. In particular, moral intuitions and sensibilities, an awareness of what is right and wrong, the duty to refrain from harming, and the duty to help others. Animals don't seem to grasp the notion of a virtue, of a duty, of another thing having intrinsic value and rights that ought to be respected. They don't seem to have the capacity to distinguish between what they most desire in the moment and what is most intrinsically desirable for them in the long run. In other words, we could say what makes them truly and consistently a good boy. Alleged altruistic behavior, Moreland asserts, alleged altruistic behavior can be explained on the basis of animal desire without attributing a sense of awareness of intrinsic duty to the animal. They can experience a conflict of desires, a desire to scratch a chair and the desire to avoid being spanked, but they don't seem to be able to distinguish between desire and duty as such. And then notably, St. Augustine once noted that animals have desires, but they do not have desires to have desires. We might put it this way. Animals don't seem to have desires to have good or better desires than the ones they currently have. They may have beliefs, volitions, thoughts, and sensations, but they do not seem to have beliefs about their beliefs. They don't choose to work on themselves to have better beliefs and choices, resolving to make better ones in the future. They don't seem to have awareness of themselves as selves. In short, they don't seem to be able to transcend their own states, bodily and mental states, and engage in reflection or to provide justification for their actions. So all of this is to note that both plants and animals are precious creatures of God, and the scriptural teaching is very clear that they need to be understood and respected and cared for, each in its own right. But the human person, particularly the faculties of mind, or what's traditionally called the soul, is far more richly structured, and it's far more dependent. It is far less dependent on the body and the sense organs. Human beings, I would contend, are created in the image of God, are different in that we are not to be dominated by and directed or governed by our innate impulses, drives, and self-perception. So strictly speaking, I do have some reservations about using the language of awareness, intentionality, and discernment, even if conceived as rudimentary. They're obviously working by analogy and employing metaphors just as well. But cells don't have self-awareness, and arguably the other forms of biological life, even the higher primates. We've noted some of the distinguishing features of members of the species of human persons. So we do have difficulty avoiding anthropomorphizing language, but we do need to press for conceptual and linguistic precision if our aim is to defend the value and dignity of the human person. The other point that in sum, I would argue that if we hold human beings are moral agents in the ways that were just briefly sketched here, we would do well to adopt a deflationary approach in our discourse around human beings and personhood, which entails, among other things, not ascribing properly personal qualities and capacities to other genera and species unless it is warranted by observation of features that exceed strictly biological properties. This is in no way to denigrate them or devalue them. It's simply to recommend that we do all that we can to avoid making a category mistake or to lend ourselves to such impressions if we care about the defense of human personhood, the dignity and the uniqueness of human personhood. Then the second point that I want to raise for consideration is related to C.S. Lewis's observation of what's at stake. It is, as Jens says, he raises the all-important political question. The battle is to master nature. The battle to master nature will be won, but who precisely will have won it? I want to argue that the question of well-being cannot be reduced to politics alone. Rather, a case in point would be a recent study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association on October 10th, so just a little bit over a week ago. The title of the study is Misrepresentation and Non-Adherence Regarding COVID-19 Public Health Measures. And so this article outlines a study which was administered at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic in December of 2021. And in this national study, more than 40% of Americans were untruthful about whether they had the virus or were ignoring safety precautions, a nationwide survey shows. I'm just going to read a few of the really salient points here to the point that I want to make. Wrap up? Okay, all right. The most common reasons for the lack of transparency were that people wanted to feel normal or to exercise personal freedom. Interestingly, the study did not find an association between misrepresentation and political beliefs, party affiliation, or religion. So I raise this because I want to ask whether the dangers of the techno-scientific transhumanist vision implemented by society is the single greatest threat facing us. I would contend it is one, but it's not even, but I would want to place alongside that not only ethical, but characterological kinds of concerns as well. And I would submit that actually, if we could address those kinds of issues, that would help us to resist the lure of succumbing to the scientific techno vision, and in the process, really, as moral agents, conceding ourselves, giving ourselves over to that. We still retain agency and the capacity to choose otherwise. Thank you.
Okay, friends, thank you so much, very much to our respondents. Appreciate that very much. And if you have questions and thoughts that you would like to contribute, please do go to one of the mics. But before you get a chance to speak, Dr. Zimmermann will have a chance to respond to each of our respondents. So thank you, Jens.
Yes, I'll do it very briefly. Sorry, we've carried on a bit longer than we thought. I'll start with Lisa, because that's fresher in my mind. I'll just say it's slightly unfair to dump all of this in these details. Like, I can't possibly respond to that in this short time. The second argument, to retain moral agency, I didn't quite get the connection that you made to the COVID scenario. Yes, indeed, and I'm hoping that our moral agency, which I would affirm, and I'll say something more about your other first point, but the problem is precisely that moral agency, as Brent said, is undermined by this technovision, right? I mean, precisely the responsibility we ought to have as human beings as part of the image of God is being denied if you're just a program that can be altered. So I have a hope that nature itself will fight back. Human nature will not be will not ultimately succumb to this because it will resist these impositions, but it just depends how strong the propaganda and these control impositions will be. on your first point, I agree with you, and none of what you said is incompatible in some ways what I've said. I know I was more lax in how I expressed this. So the book, to understand my position, to refer to would be Hans Jonas's Phenomenology of Life. So I've been deeply influenced by that. And so he is very careful to when he speaks of rudimentary intentionality, to say that that is not the human intentionality, nor is there, it's analogous language, nor is there a seamless development up, right, to that. And I think ultimately, I would completely affirm with you that it's hugely important to affirm human responsibility. Why? Because there is a tendency today to diminish the human in order to upgrade or to upgrade the animal, and we do that because we feel so bad for treating animals purely, not recognizing their status as a living being or God's creature, as you said. But I think the only solution possible is to actually recognize that our exceptionality as human beings lies in the responsibility that we have toward creation, because nobody else has it, because we are made in God's image, right? So the solution is not to downgrade the human in order to do restitution to what we've done wrong, but to actually draw us up to the responsibility that is God-given, because we're the only ones that has it. I just don't see a bunch of elephants or panda bears getting together and, wanting to form Greenpeace, let's say. That's just not going to happen. And therefore it's important. There was a lot in the middle of what you said that we really need to talk very carefully about. You reminded me a little bit of my allergy to analytic philosophy and some of the things. Ultimately, I think, I'll tell you straight up, ultimately I think that the ultimate thing, because logos is not just reason, logos is, from the patristic, my understanding from logikoi is to be logos shaped, which has a lot more to do than just rationality.
So Jens, I'm going to get you to move on.
I'm going to stop. Okay, I'm going to move to Brent. But anyway, I want to affirm what you've said, and I think you said enough there. So Brent, what I love about your response, and I obviously didn't fly you out to just flatter me. Yeah, yes, I did. That's why we had Lisa as well. You talked about these three things. I'm going to summarize it like this: love, attention, risk. And that, I think, is really important, because what we are seeing, I think, is that we are losing our attention, which is love, giving attention, through our immersion in a technology that diverts us constantly and diverts our attention. If we can pay attention to others and to God, this actually affects our Christianity. Worship is attention. Worship is attention to God. If we unlearn attentiveness, this is really hitting at the heart of our relation to others and to God. So, and this love attention is risky. It takes risk to pay attention, to be rebuffed, to be corrected, to be unselfed, one of your favorite terms. And I think we are unlearning that. I think we are constantly in danger of preferring safety to taking the risk of loving. And I think that's a real problem. And then I'm just going to say to President Greenman and my good dean, Christmas just might come early and often.
Good deal. Lots of surprises. Okay, friends, we have 3 people on this side and 3 people on this side. I'm thinking, judging by the length of the answers so far, this is probably the number. But we'll see how it goes. But over to you first, please.
Okay, hi. So my question is, do you think that human enhancement will become mandatory and compulsory according to the orders of a transhumanist theocracy? And I'm very suspicious because the reason I'm asking this is I don't own a cell phone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very badly. I heard the first part. I heard the first part. Whether, can I use this one? I'll just go there. Sorry. So I heard the first part of your question. I couldn't hear the second. Like you asked whether enhancement would become mandatory.
Human enhancement would become mandatory according to like a transhumanist theocracy. And the reason I'm suspicious of this is because I don't own a cell phone and I haven't owned one for 4 years. And I wasn't allowed to cross into the Canadian border where my family lives. And because I didn't have the CAN app. And I said, I don't own a cell phone. They didn't let me go. And I'm a Canadian citizen. And then, where I was in France, I became a person non grata. I wasn't allowed to use any amenities or travel.
Okay, thank you. We've got the question.
Either,
That's great.
Based on this non-ownership.
Yeah, this is a good question. I'll give you a much simpler example. I tried to park at Carey Hall, which is a residence just down the road, and I couldn't, my stupid phone was too old to work with their parking apps. There's no longer a human person that fills out your parking ticket. So I was standing there and you can't park, sorry, now what do I do? So the real question is that don't even need to be malevolent persons who want to enslave you. It's the technological progress that will leave some people out of access to the increasing access-driven bubble that we're creating. And it's only when you have the latest app, the latest thing. And so it might become compulsory just by the fact you're in or out. But again, like I'm thinking that at some point, human beings will probably resist and just will begin to create alternative communities where you don't need that stuff and you can still function, I'm hoping. But it is a real problem that's systemic. You don't even need technocratic overlords. If we keep endorsing this kind of computational world that we're really creating, where you don't have access if you don't have the right technology. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And over to David, please.
Thank you for the eloquent lecture and congratulations on the launch of the center. I'm very excited to have it here. A question about policy. You were critical of reductive and utilitarian approaches to policy. Your response seemed to be love of the other must be like that of mother to the child. And I just wonder if it's appropriate to transpose that kind of familial, close relationship into other spheres like governance. Mm-hmm. And if not, what you'd suggest as ethical approach to policy that would be a counter to what you've criticized.
Yeah, great question. Thank you, David. And maybe, if you guys want to answer. Yeah, I think, okay, I'll take that duly chastened. I don't think you can one-on-one. That would be as inappropriate as any sort of other analogous stuff, right? I mean, when a corporation says to you, well, we're all one big family, aren't we? I mean, immediately, your antenna, your red flag should go up, So who are you then, my father, who will, give me house arrest or what? That's not going to work. But I do think that there's something in that analogy which means I'm going to presume that I want to treat you, that mother wants to ultimately treat you as a responsible being that will have internalized certain rules, an ethical framework, but will comply out of, or will practice that out of his or her own free will. So there must be an appeal to rational, like what Lisa was saying basically, right? Moral agency, and to do that in freedom, in free recognition. And if that's not given, I think that's the ideal where our education wants to go, right? I don't want students as little as the mother wants constant dependent. I mean, that might feed my ego, but I don't want my students to be dependent on me. I want them to at some point be better than me. Yeah, so, and I think that you can put into governmental policy structure, right? You recognize that that's how we have to do it. And it's messy. People don't like it because that means you have to have consultation, you have to have people talking back, you have to have, it's work. It's much easier to just ram it down the, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I just had a word of concern for Jens from Professor Houston. He's just concerned that Jens is working very hard tonight, so let's go easy on him.
This is Jim, this is what we live for. This is what we do.
He's concerned for your well-being. So you're doing okay?
Yeah, I'm doing fine.
Great. Brother, Matt, please.
Fantastic. Would love to build on that comment. We're called to embody what we hope happens as we pursue life. And you and I were both given teenagers by God to remind us of our deficiencies and inadequacies on how we're doing with that. So I'm curious how the staff of the Houston Center are going to behave in light of this lecture. And I want to ask that question from kind of the teenager perspective. Are you going to use email? Like, I'm noticing you've got a website. Are you going to be on Facebook? Are you going to be on TikTok? Like, is there a way that the staff of the Houston Center are going to engage in the digital tools that are available to us in somehow distinctive way that the staff of a different center might not do?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have to think about that. So I'll just thank you for that comment. You will not find me on Facebook. It's a good question. Like, you know, so other people who are thinking seriously about technology and so on, like Jerre L, whom I mentioned, or Steve Talbot, they refuse to use that technology. You will not find them on Facebook. You will not find them on TikTok. They don't even have a web page. They don't want to. So, I mean, we obviously have a web page, but I want to emphasize the personal interaction and dialogue. I want rather this in a full room than something else. But I'll think about that. That's a good question. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you very much. Please.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, as a former computer scientist, this was a very interesting lecture. But so for a moment to play devil's advocate and wear my computer scientist hat.
Okay, if the devil could speak loud and succinct, that'd be great.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Stand up to the mic. Come right to the mic.
To wear my to wear my computer scientist hat and ask you a question. This is not my position, but someone might say in computer science, but like technology and science has objectively made life so much better. Like machine learning, you're criticizing that for reducing humans to machines, but I mean objectively you see like people are so much like living in such a more convenient environment and everything. Like, why do I actually have to care about like functional anthropology and metaphysics and philosophy and all these problems when, you know, just life is so much like better? Like, I just want to live in the metaverse. Like, why do I have to care about philosophy?
Yeah, you don't believe that, what you just said. Because that's why you came over and you're studying theology now.
Oh,
anyway.
No, this is not my position. I'm asking.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
So it's still a good question because there's obviously, so all algorithms and artificial intelligence can do is to complete, you know, so it's a, as you well know, it's a code to fulfill a certain function and to achieve a desired goal. And for that, we can use it, as long as we use it within a human framework. If we let that take over, there's the matter of atrophying. I was actually thinking, this is a ridiculous example, right? But when I grew up, there were no beepers in cars, there were no cameras or whatever. It was an actual skill to hit that parking spot, to get in there. I knew exactly how big my car was. And it took time to learn that. I can apply that to map reading, to all other kinds. So now we completely lose a sense of dimensions. We completely rely on these things. We atrophy. That's one thing. And then the other is if we start, because we atrophy, we give ourselves over and our work over to machines. And that eventually will lead to these bizarre scenarios where one of my students sent me this example from China where, and we're thinking about this here as well, where AI is used in legal sortings and legal procedures. And there's a Chinese court that actually operates on AI. So, and then if that's linked to a social credit system, so an AI judge will condemn you, your fine is deducted or you're you know, basically convicted. And then the human judge has to say, oh, this was ridiculous, and then the human judge has to justify itself to the AI system to make sure that this is reversed. And the speed at which that happens is just absolutely frightening. So why would we ever want to go there, is my question. You know, why would you want to do that? Right? So anyway, that's...
Thank you very much. Bill, please.
So I'm going to add a little edge into our evening. I hope that's okay. And so just one comment, which I guess is critical, and then I want to move to an encouragement quickly. So Jens, on the inaugural evening of this, I have to say that I found the opening part of your lecture to be alarmist. And just in the sense of this idea that there is this sort of malevolent hegemony out there. And I have to say I don't see it. I do see life is getting more complex, Change is coming, and we're all going to wrestle at dealing with it. But I just don't see that. And I could talk about that more, but maybe that's for you and I offline. As an encouragement, I just hope that the center, more than what I might describe as a call to arms or an alarmist perspective, that it would be more along these lines, that for those out there, whether it's the few transhumanists that I think are actually there, or just many others who rely on technology to deliver more than it can.
Deliver more than a what?
That rely on technology to deliver more than it can, because technology can only deliver what it can. It can't deliver what it can. They will be disappointed, and they will miss out on so much that is good in life. And I hope that that will be the angle and the slant and the approach of the center, rather than thinking that somehow, I think there's a lot bigger problems than what technology is pushing us towards. And it begins in other parts of the human experience. So I just want to encourage the center on its inaugural evening to help the world avoid the disappointment of technology, rather than out of some concern that we're going to end up with more authoritarians, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think on the first point, I agree with you. So I'll start from the back. I think that's why I said criticism is not the main goal. The main goal is to develop a positive anthropology along the line that Lisa was doing, so that you can revive the Christian tradition in that and cooperate with people who are also interested in defending humanity, no matter what discipline or creed or faith they come from. That's really important. So that, to me, would be the main function of the center. And we can talk about the other thing. I just think you're naive. I think it is simply, you're underestimating the kind of thing that is happening through our continual immersion in technology, how it slowly erodes our self-understanding. Now, I don't think, my hope is precisely what C.S. Lewis says, that there is a creation, that there is a natural thing which will push back. So I don't think it will win. My question is, how long will it take until we see what's going on, so that the damage is not too much for us, that the pain will not be too great to return to something better. But
just real quick, I would add to that.
Use the mic?
Do I have to? It's technology. If technology were merely machines and gadgets, it would be alarmist. But the problem is it's much more than that. It is a metaphysic now. And you have to, I think, take Heidegger seriously at this point in saying we are so deeply inframed in it, we can't escape it. And therefore, we can't make moral judgments of the very metaphysic what drives us. That's the problem. That's not alarmist. I think that's back to Grant's principle. It's dark. Name it as such, and then maybe you can search for light. Long time ago. Very long time, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jens. And for the gentleman who was asking about alternative strategies for marketing, I would like to point out that both of the staff members of the Houston Center, neither of us have social media. So I don't know, for whatever that's worth. An important part of the lecture has been properly construing who our enemies are, who's opposing a sort of full orb division of personhood. And Jens and Brent, you both mentioned Gnosticism. The way that you put it, Jens, was that Christianity resists all Gnostic impulses, and I'm assuming that that had something to do with the Gnostic kind of resistance, the body or something along those lines. I'm growing increasingly skeptical that that's actually a helpful way of construing the relationship between Gnosticism and Christianity. It seems to me that the radical ontological distinction between spirit and matter that the Gnostics held and took too far is actually much closer to Gregory of Nyssa, Evagrius, Maximus, and dare I say the Apostle Paul.
Can we get to the question?
The question is not Gnosticism and that vision of spirit and matter and their interaction a stronger ally than those who would sort of dogmatically insist on the importance of embodiment?
I don't know, interesting question. I mean, what Descartes, what Gnosticism gets at and what Descartes gets at, that we are self-transcendent beings. So there's something in us, as Lisa said, we can transcend nature, and we do that in a sense of a moral responsibility that others don't have. We also, of course, do it in a sense of that we have an imagination, that we can imagine ourselves otherwise, and that's precisely why we can also, while we're malleable, right, while we can be shaped in certain ways, which is why propaganda works on us, but it wouldn't work on, on your dog. But I don't, there's a danger, obviously, right? I mean, this is what the early church did, is if you disembody that ability, there's a problem. So if you want to say that the Gnostics recognize that there is something that is not reducible to matter, that's cool, but them isolating it at the expense of the body, and to see the body merely then as a problem that hinders that transcendence and therefore needs to be done away with or circumvented, that's precisely what the transhumanists want to do, right? Your body is a problem, it needs to be gotten rid of. So for me, the genius of Christianity lies in the fact that it actually affirms the body, and that our spirit is rooted in that, and therefore, as we all know, I mean, if you haven't had your coffee and you don't have breakfast, you can't study very well. I mean, we are still embodied creatures, right? So I think it's about the balance.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to bring things to a close. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Please join me in thanking Jens and our respondents tonight. Thank you especially to all of you for coming tonight. Thank you for your interest in the Houston Center. I do hope that you will continue to be interested in the center. I would like to say this, that notwithstanding the extreme antipathy towards social media, you can find more information about the Houston Center at thehoustoncenter.org. It is our website, so please do pay attention to that, and there will be ongoing information that will come your way. Do you have something of this nature?
I just want to thank you for hosting us. And and I just want to say, Bill, I hear your concern, right? And I just want to, the upcoming events in the center, I just want to mention 3 of them. We'll show you this is not an alarmist enterprise, but it is a critical one. We have a seminar and lecture coming up next year with John Baer on patristic anthropology. We have David Cayley after him, who is the CBC Ideas organizer, has been for 30 years, who will speak on Ivan Illich and the problems of our day. It will be great interaction. And then after that, we'll have a psychiatrist, Aaron Cariati, who will come and speak on the problem in medical system in terms of technology and biosecurity and things like that. So it's a broader mix, and it's all concerned about developing a robust, self-reflective anthropology from the Christian tradition in cooperation with others, from which we can criticize. Right? So, thank you.
Great, thank you. And just one final infomercial is that the Regent College Lang lectures will be held here in this room at 12:30 next Wednesday, where Dr. John Milbank will be speaking to us. So if you're able to join us, either in person or online, please do come for that. But so, thank you all for coming. It's been lovely to have you. Good night.